I've been going for a while. The Gardens has been going for a while, and always a pleasure to come back, just to sit and to take some time in what is. It's always been to me slightly paradoxical. It feels very big. Whenever I sit in it, it always feels quite a grand space, but actually it's incredibly small. I think little over 1.5 acres. That was one of the beauties of Rolf's design, was that because it starts with the lawn and creates this open space, and then these pockets, these small areas that you can go out and find little micro design in and microclimates. It was always that idea of thinking very carefully about how you move through and how you really use every inch, and every inch of that space was used and reutilized in interesting ways. And I think that's the beauty of the design, because you can still feel like you can lose yourself in it. It's very odd. And over the years, it's a place that I've seen be very social. The more recent day we're looking at now is one of those days. But it's also a place where you can be on your own. And it's a funny thing in life, because that aloneness isn't something that's very... it's not often portrayed as a very positive feeling in our culture. That to be alone always implies loneliness and not being with other people. But one of the great things about a garden is that you can be on your own there, because if you're just seeing or sitting or spending time there, your dialogue is with the form of the garden itself. Your dialogue is with nature and your place within it. And it's something that I've always liked about this garden and many gardens, is that it allows you to be on your own and to feel comfortable on your own, and to take that time at any point in a day, simply to stop, get a little bit of space in whatever busy life you're going through. And I think today I was going to more try and give us a snapshot of certain memories from when we set the gardens up. I'm not going to, in any sense, attempt to make a complete speech about it. I thought I would just give some snapshots which might, through that, give an insight into where I was coming from and where the people I was coming from, where the people I was working with were at that time, and how we worked together to make this, because it was quite particular. It's not in any sense typical of the way gardens are made or the way they're managed. It's probably the first thing I'll say is that the reason why the garden feels good is because there's been a sort of duty of care and a stewardship over the 10 years that I think is quite remarkable. You can't take it for granted. I remember in the very early days when we didn't know if we would even be here in 10 years. In other words, would it be possible to raise the money to keep the garden going? And at that time, there was a really great supporter in Glasgow City Council called Charles Bell. And with Charles, we sat down and we said, look, maybe we can get the Parks Department to come in and clip the trees for us and cut the grass every 3 weeks. And that way we could save £50,000 a year, and we were desperately trying to find ways to see how we could keep it open. And I remember him, immortal words, you don't want the dead hand of the council on your shoulder. The bony hand of the institution crushing the life out of your little garden. And he was right. He was just being very honest, because I'm not really having a pop at the council. It's almost impossible for those kind of big corporations to be bespoke, to do things, to maintain things in a way that show a real fine level of care. There are odd exceptions in parks around Glasgow, normally driven by individually great park managers. But in general, there's a certain banality about the way gardens are kept and the way the public are allowed to use them. And in the case of the hidden gardens, it's always just been beautifully kept. The way the grass is cut, the way it's only been 2 gardeners over the 10 years. The way the volunteers have managed it. You walk into a place that feels loved. You walk into a place that feels cared for. And you really can't take that for granted, because I'm working on another long-term capital work at St. Peter's Seminary, Kilmahew Woodlands. And for a year we got a local growing group going, and we came back into the walled gardens in that very old environment. And people started growing food there again for the first time in 28 years. This year we had to stop because the space got too dangerous, and we couldn't keep access at this point in time until some more work was done. And literally within 2.5 months, these really beautifully kept spaces were just overgrown with thistles and nettles and briars, and it just took it back. It took it back so quickly. Thumph, nature, real nature, clawing back and doing what it does best. So all of those moves to make things neat and to make things readable, and in a sense to control and manipulate nature in the way that a garden does. It's a very constructed landscape. It's an idea. It's an idea, and it's a playful way of working with natural forms, but unashamedly moving and controlling them in particular ways. And that although there is the sort of wilder areas in the hidden gardens, it is primarily a manicured space. And that was a choice that was taken early on. I remember really trying to wind Rolf up in the early days about my desire to have quote-unquote fairy mounds in the garden. And Rolf is a designer who likes a clean edge. And I remember him looking with absolute disgust at me as I said, couldn't we have a sinuous form moving through here? And he went, no, the lines will be straight. And I have to say, he was absolutely right. And we did have some great arguments, just about how you would use what was there and what you would bring to it. And the great thing about Rolf and Chris, and it was City Design at the time, is that they had a very, very clear idea of what would work. And it's always useful to have that as a starting point. And it's strange, this thing, because when I talk about it, sometimes I talk about the hidden gardens as an idea, as a metaphor, and other times you talk about the practical reality of making a garden. And for me, that's just my way of working. I often think in big idea terms, or from a more philosophical perspective or a political perspective, and then see how that filters down and see how that affects the vision for how something is then made in practical terms. And it doesn't always work, but when it does work well, what you have is a sort of coalescing around that idea, and it gives people a really strong sense of purpose and a strong sense of being able to work together collectively and to use their individual skills to make that piece of work. And about a year before we actually got this off the ground, I was down here at Tramway at a seminar which had people from different parts of the world who were over for the Edinburgh Festival. They'd escaped for a day to come and see life in the West and to see some of the cultural operations in Glasgow. And that day I met a man called Divya Patir from Mumbai, formerly Bombay. And there's sometimes you just look at someone and you have a little spark. And I just said to Divya, I said, do you want to get out of here? And we literally sort of ran away. And I'd never met him before, and I ended up taking him back to my house, and we cooked a really lovely meal. So I'm gonna wind that back. And my partner had cooked a lovely meal. Let's be honest about this. I didn't cook a lovely meal. There was a lovely meal there. And we shared that meal, and then I introduced him to Royal Lochnagar, a really fine malt whiskey that he drinks to this day. And we talked about life, and we talked about the deeper values, the values of not religion, but spirit, and as many people know these days, there's lots of varied definitions between those who are overtly religious or follow a particular monotheistic faith. Some who don't believe in anything, some who just don't know. But for me, I've always just had an inquiring mind. I've always just wanted to, whether somebody comes from an extremely orthodox background or whether they're completely the other way, the main thing is to know and understand them and understand where they're coming from. And Divya was one of those people, and he was, in many senses, further down the line than me. Born into a Hindu background, but he'd been open to lots of different influences. And India is special that way, in the sense that there's, I think, Hinduism in many ways accepts that there are many ways to come to the truth, or to a particular truth. You don't just have one route and you follow that route, and at the end result of that you know. In India, people manifest many thousands of different ways of practicing and finding what gives them deeper value in their own life. And I instinctively found that very appealing, and he began to exert a quiet influence on me, and I just thought that this is a man who really knows something, and I wanted to bring him back and to create a role for him, a sort of artist without portfolio, right from the very beginning. And it was an instinct that said that there might be a way of working, together with a very diverse and skilled group of people to make something special happen in this, what was then a pretty ruined space behind Tramway. Piles of rubble, just detritus from various different periods of use in the back. And then as Rolf found out, and we'll talk about these amazing layers of history on the site that went back 150, 200 years as you began to scrape back and discover what was underneath. But with Divya, what I wanted to do was to just simply allow him to watch the way we were working, and to quietly challenge some of the presumptions that we make about the value of our own work, the value of our own thoughts, and to see if there was a way of knitting together different artists' work when we made the garden. That was the starting point, was that I would put a really interesting range of artists together to work alongside the design team, and that together we would create this integrated form. And that way of working, most people who know individual artists, those who have a solo practice, know that they're often quite driven people. You know, they really have to make their living from very much what is rattling around inside their own heads, and everyone has different skills, and some of them are intensely articulate about it, and then others can hardly express what they're doing. It all comes out through their hands, or through their designs, or through their paintings or sculpture or installations, or however they work. But often they are, I found often in quite a kind of tight, isolated space in the way they think and make work, because that's what they have to do. They spend a lot of time on their own thinking and working through the particular issues that they have to create and make their work. And so that first challenge was to get people to make really strong individual work, but for it to seed and work together as part of a total design. And maybe those are just words, but it was a long, slow, and very careful process. And there were difficult pieces here. Julie Brooks' rill at the back of the garden, the circular form, which when it's working beautifully circulates water around. What a job. We're probably talking 4 or 5 years to keep that grass growing on either sides of that shape. 4 or 5 years of continual work by a team of people. And Katie Nichol, who supported Julie in the making of that work, spent hundreds of hours working through the designs with her to integrate that meaningfully into that space of the garden. Likewise, Steve Skrinker's amazing upturned stiletto heels, they were really, really difficult to make work. He had beautiful ideas, but the actual making it work in that place was very, very hard. And He had lots of amazing ideas early on. There was one with greyhounds and greyhound traps. I can't remember what happened to that idea. But that's what you go through when you have a great abstract mind like Steve's. You get these amazing ideas come out, and you work through to find the right one. But that way that Divya affected the way everyone worked together was also manifest in the way the wider import of the garden was brought to life. Claire Hunter, who is here today, worked with us very closely to begin routing tramway for the first time in its history in the place it actually is, East Pollock Shields, Govan Hill. Tramway back in the late 80s and early 90s, it could have been anywhere apart from here. You had some great avant-garde work taking place in the building, but it certainly wasn't a place that anyone who lived within 3 or 4 miles ever came into. People used to travel here because they came to see a particular artist's work or performance. It wasn't rooted in any sense. So that was really the first time in its history. This would be 12, 14 years after it opened, that you began to realize just how invisible the building was. And then we realized that the garden could be a new way to build a relationship with the people who actually lived and whose lives play out in the streets around here. There were simple steps we took, like translating all our signage into Punjabi, Urdu, English, opening up the back route into the gardens before Scottish Ballet was there, rather than making people feel they had to walk through an imposing post-industrial art centre in order to access the garden. And all of those things about thresholds and bridges and how you make people feel comfortable, how something becomes something that people own themselves. There are subtle design decisions that help that. And I think I'll just touch briefly on this, but the wider idea behind the garden, what I hoped it would embrace in the beginning, was that in the same way that Divya was working with this artistic team and with NVA and the design team, Rolf and Chris, to bring together this composite work. So that was the route, that was the basis for making the garden, was that we would look at the way gardens play out across all the main faith systems, and the way that an aspect of something to some people divine on earth, or simply a paradise on earth, again you can look at it in a secular or a directly religious way, but the way the garden as a form throughout history has been an incredible physical way to manifest those ideas. And I love the idea that we were going away from text and going away from religious text to something that was very physical and was undogmatic, and that you could begin over time to find the strands that connect across all faith systems and how they can be manifest in a garden. And that was very clear. It was a very, very clear desire. And hopefully what we did in our conversations, we had hundreds of conversations with people from all backgrounds and all different faith perspectives. And the one thing we said at the beginning is we're not going to come here and promise that we'll make a pastiche of a Mogul garden or a pastiche of a Christian monastic garden. What we'll do is talk honestly, listen to ideas, and listen to a proper intellectual engagement in the idea of what a garden can be, and then let a really, really good design team hear that and allow that to influence them and influence their designs. And I think that the end did make that manifest. I think that what you got in the end was that combination on quite a profound level. And simultaneously to that period was the British and American invasion of Iraq. And the gardens, we started the idea in 2001, and it took two and a half years to make. So it was right through that period that the Iraq War was kicking off, and almost everyone I know was at the demonstrations, the largest anti-war demonstrations in recent history, and were deeply affected by what we felt was a betrayal, the final betrayal of the left in Britain, where people who we had voted in to replace the right-wing ideology of the Conservative government 10 years later on really took a series of moral decisions and political decisions that were the end of the line in terms of being able to believe that a political orthodoxy would, in any sense, follow real belief. And that betrayal, it's still playing out to this day. And I think to hundreds of thousands of people, that you don't forgive that. It's unforgivable because they really destroyed a sense of optimism and hope of political change. And it gave a different seriousness to the garden. It gave a different seriousness to how we would work with different cultures and how their really increasing insecurity and increasing sense of impotence at what was happening worldwide and how this was playing out would be seen. So I think the garden, and it's difficult here because I don't want to say things that make it sound pretentious. It's just a small garden. It's just a few hundred people or a few thousand people. But it's a very small symbolic step to say we reject this completely, and to find ways of allowing people to express themselves within their own faith in one open space. It's just a tiny, tiny step. But here we are 10 years on, and the same realities are playing out across the world. And it seems to me that the aspirations of this garden and that aspiration to respect otherness, to respect what is not what you were born into, from any perspective coming in, it just seems as important as ever. If there's one thing humans need to do, is we need to learn simply to accept difference. Because without that, there's literally no hope for humanity. It doesn't matter whether it's manifest through religious, sexual, political, it doesn't matter, whatever causes difference, unless you can sit down and say, I accept your difference, there's no hope for us. And that I don't know how you all feel, I just don't feel we're living through particularly hopeful times just now. And I think it is important to have small, symbolic things that work. And we're incredibly lucky living in Britain, make no mistake. We're incredibly lucky to be living in a culture which, even in a recession, there's none of the problems that are being faced by people in other parts of the world. So there is a chance to do things which are more positive, more optimistic, and to reflect that in this culture. So that's the other side. That for me is the other layer that makes the Hidden Garden special. I kind of hoped it would be more visible. I have to say, if I've got one, not regret, over the last 10 years, I think the garden's worked incredibly well on a level of just allowing people to feel themselves and to come in and take it, and it's worked on a local level very, very effectively. But I somehow wanted it to also take those bigger political issues and to sort of shout what it was doing a bit louder, because those issues are vast and they are affecting so much of contemporary life. It seems that what's been done here, it should really be used as a model for how people can live and work together effectively. And the festivals of light that we did were probably, again, just taking snapshot memories. I remember when we did the first Eid here at the end of Ramadan. I think probably in Tramway's history, it's the most people have ever been in this building. We had about 3,500. And it was a phenomenal turnout. I mean, it was indescribable, the energy in the building when we did Eid, and created lightworks in the garden at night. I remember standing next to a woman on the balcony. She'd have been from quite a strict Muslim background, and we just stood there looking out on the garden. And she turned to me and she said, I feel visible for the first time. She had a big smile, and she just went, it's just fantastic. It was her Christmas, you know, and I just thought, God, this is it. This is this feeling of just allowing people to be themselves. That's what a garden can do, just allow people to be themselves. So I'm going to wrap up there, and Rolf's going to take us more into the design talk itself, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions after that. I thought it'd be quite important to remember back to a couple of things on the day we actually opened 10 years ago. And that would have been June, of course. And one thing that a lot of people don't see is that outside there's a little carved stone inset on the chimney. And it's at about head height. It's a little lotus flower. And it just says under it, peace to all living things. Peace to all living things. And if you put your hand onto the lotus, it fits perfectly. It's designed by Lindsay John, very good sculptor. And if you lay your hand on the flower shape, the flower perfectly fits with the form of your hand. And the idea of that was to create an industrial stupa. And those of you who know Buddhist history will know the stupa is a form that's repeated across many Asian countries. And it's a form of kind of, best way to describe a stupa, although many of them are used for relics or used for ashes, and are also used to mark various points. If you go back to really early use of the stupa, which would be probably oldest form would be pre-Tibetan Buddhist Bon Po religion. We're going back 4,000 or 5,000 BC. The stupa, if you can imagine in acupuncture, the way a needle is placed into the body at a particular point, and that has if they get it right, there's a particular energy. Always been amazing in Chinese medicine where someone can perform surgery on someone's hand with no drugs because they've managed to isolate the hand from the pain centers above it. And in the same way, a stupa is the equivalent of that in a landscape. So if going back to that very, very old way of reading a landscape, the form of a landscape will have stupas placed within it, and they themselves are points to release energy back out into the world. So I love this idea of an industrial stupa. And the idea that on a really simple level, when you come to a garden, because it's mostly makes you feel pretty good. If you felt bad when you walked in, you normally feel a bit better when you walk out. Or if you felt happy, you feel a bit happier. It's what gardens do. So it's a generator. It's actually generating, in hundreds of thousands of people over the years, it's generating good feeling. And that's got a bit better than bad feeling. I like that. It's just simple, isn't it? It just generates good feeling. And again, it's a very simple things, but it's little steps to making life a better life to live, and to share with those who you share it with and who come into that place at the same time. So the two thoughts. Sorry, I'm a terrible. It's like Billy Connolly without the jokes. Coming back to the start of that, the two things I remember from that opening day was that the gardens were funded by 43 separate funders, and we raised that money over 2 years. The last 60,000 came in, I think, 3 weeks before we were due to open, and that was the two long raised beds. And in Rolf's design, he'd left a space for the raised beds, and we said, no, should we fill it in? Should we do it? No, we'll just keep it. We'll get the money. We'll get the money. We'll get the money. And we sort of kept that space empty in the design, and then finally this environmental trust came in from somewhere down in Hertfordshire or something. I mean, it was really random. We were really working hard to pull the money from any source we could. And the raised beds got built, and I remember racing up to Greenbank Gardens and to buy some herbs. and to put some sensory herbs in. And even to this day, that herb garden still runs with that sensory feel. And literally, we were planting them in sort of 10 minutes before the gates opened. So it was that wonderful sense of being right up to the last minute, and then you open the doors and everything looks perfect. So wipe the sweat away. The other thing I remember is, and it's still really for me that one of my strongest images that I'll take away from it was that on the opening day in the morning, the gardens were built by land engineering. They got the contract to do the hard landscaping. And they were, in the first place, they were the most expensive. And I remember we had someone else in who was cheaper, and that's always one of the problems where you're kind of forced through public tender to sometimes you're meant to take the cheaper one. And we had this horrific few months where the cheaper one ended up being someone who was this guy having a nervous breakdown. He was driving a sports car who'd run away from his wife, and it was like, and he came and said, "I'll sort you out, son. The gardens is going to be brilliant. Just don't you worry, we'll do it." And we were going. It just felt all wrong. He was wrong. It was wrong. We needed to work with people who cared, and we went back to land engineering and said, "Can you do it a bit cheaper? We've got this much money to spend. Whatever, it's a £460,000 contract." And they said, "Yeah, we'll do it. And we'll do it for you." But they didn't do it by then cutting corners to make the money back. They did it really well, and they did it with that duty of care that's there with all the volunteers and all the people who've run it for the last 10 years. And on that last morning, there was a young guy, one of the builders, kneeling on that area of sand that you see running straight down, and he was going along the side of the grass with a pair of scissors just cutting the edge. He was there for 3 hours, just quietly cutting. No one had asked him to do this, and I thought, then you know that it's connected. You know that the original idea, right the way through to it finally being manifest, has connected, and people are all doing the best they can to make this a special place, which 10 years on, we're still enjoying. That's it. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Angus. Thanks, everybody. I'm not actually going to talk about the design for a number of reasons, but principally, I mean, there are a lot of ideas in the design of the gardens that myself and Chris, who I saw is here today, which is great, developed, and all of the artists. And I think it's that thing of standing and sort of pointing to particular things and explaining why, what for, and so on, kind of deadens it. And I think there's some familiar faces in the audience. I think many of you know the gardens. If you don't, there are audio guides you can take around. There are also staff in the gardens who can answer lots of questions like that. So it was really, in thinking about what to talk about today, apart from putting on a 10-year-old T-shirt from the opening, was it's the newest one I've got, actually. It's was just thinking, you know, what are the important things? I mean, you know, I'm a landscape architect. Chris is a landscape architect. We're involved in the design individually of lots of different things. And for myself, I was thinking, you know, what are the particular things about the hidden gardens? And the first thought that a number of other thoughts rolled out from was that nobody asked for the hidden gardens. It wasn't something that from, if you like, on high within the council or any other level, somebody said, let's do this, let's create a sanctuary garden dedicated to peace at the back of the tramway. And I think, you know, Angus touched on a number of things. He said some nice things. I'll say some nice things back, is that I think some of the great strengths of the way Angus and NVA work are to do with the process and the approach to projects. And I think a couple of aspects of that are that because nobody asked for the hidden gardens, it was an open question as to what sort of space it should or could be. And one of the starting points was, Angus touched on the dialogue and the relationship with Divya, and the sense that the gardens should have, if you like, a spiritual meaning for the people who are in the surrounding communities. Now, in some ways, that's a very simple statement or concept or ideal, the challenge within that then is how do you make that real? How do you make that meaningful? How do you make that not, there are lots of ways in which that could go, horrifically wrong. And that open question then sort of demanded a lot of other questions to be asked. And around that, a process was set up that ran for over a year, where there was open dialogue and discussion with all of the different communities in the area. And that process was really led and taken forward by Claire Hunter, who is also here today. Claire, can you just put your hand up wherever you are? The lady with the crumbs on her face. But Claire really sort of structured research, developed that process. And I think just touching on a few aspects of that was that it started from very broad questions to then, over the course of that whole year or so, to ask increasingly particular questions and to have a more involved dialogue with groups and individual people. But the very start of it was a questionnaire, which I was trying to remember exactly what the questions are, but I think the 4 questions were, what's your idea of paradise? What's your ideal garden? And then some slightly more specific, what do you think is missing from the area here? And what do you think should happen behind tramway? And those are the kind of questions you should never put in a questionnaire, because obviously they're completely open-ended. But in all of the responses that came back and all of the sort of unpicking and sifting and so on of those, what was quite remarkable, I think we were all probably surprised about, was I think around 2/3 of them talked in some way or another about it becoming a green contemplative space, which where in terms of early fragments or discussions people say, let's have some swings for the kids, let's have this, let's have that. It really started from that point to establish the direction for the project and what the space should be. And as I say, from that, there was this ongoing process of talking to lots of people in a more focused and particular way. Within that, talking about different cultural traditions, different horticultural traditions, talking about specific plants, and all of the sort of ideas and the depth of thought that's within the design sort of really being fed by that process. And that process feeding, if you like, the creative team, the designers, myself and Chris, the 5 artists and everybody else involved with the project. And I think that process is, it shouldn't be unique, but it has proven to be relatively unique, I think, to that project. And really just to underline, I think, maybe why what's important about it is this thing about the open question, the idea that what the space should or could be could evolve through the process, that there was the opportunity to keep asking and going back and developing that thought, so that it wasn't like starting with a proposition for it should be this kind of space, and that maybe then ultimately didn't fit. It really could evolve very particularly to the site and to the desires and the needs of the people living around it. And often that isn't the case in the way public space is designed and created. And I think a point related to that is that it moves away from this process of, if you like, a top-down thought process where a project's delivered, for instance, by a local authority or whoever it may be, and there's a sort of a higher level decision about a certain kind of thing should happen on a site. And equally, it's not, if you like, the classic, as it's referred to, the bottom-up process where it's completely driven by the community. So it's something else. It's something else. And I think this idea of the sort of proactive, creative team, NVA driving that process, putting a creative team together so that, if you like, that creative process wasn't squeezed out, that creative process was at the core of it. It didn't become about a direct, sort of funding or politically driven thought about there should be this kind of thing, and then an output, a physical thing appears on the site. It was really an evolution, and I think that was profoundly important and really is one of the core reasons why the Hidden Gardens has been such a success. And around that, what that enabled was really, I think, what you could describe as a respectful relationship between the communities and the creative team. So it wasn't a, here it is, or the designer's not listening, or the community feeling that there's a difficult process there. And with all of those inputs, the challenges of then the design process were to draw all of that together into something simple and focused that delivered all of these things. And whilst it is and was, it's a simple, in some ways, I suppose, contemporary design, it's layered with lots of ideas within it. When those designs were shown back, reflected back to the community, they recognized it through the discussions. It was a different kind of space than may have appeared through a different process, but they recognized how it related to that, and there was a sense of ownership and meaning to it. The design of the gardens, as we've touched on, Angus touched on earlier, one of them is about the history of the site and this sort of layering of the site, and the other was the dialogue with the communities and the individuals who lived around it. And I think that really is embedded in every aspect of it. And as I say, I think in terms of the detail of that, the audio guides and so on give you a pretty good steer on it. Moving on from that, I really wanted to talk about beyond the design stage, the process of design for the gardens is how it's evolved over the following 10 years. And the starting point of the fact that the hidden gardens represents an ideal. And as it's been described from Amanda's introduction, it's described as a sanctuary garden dedicated to peace. It represents an ideal of how we should relate to one another and also, I guess, how we might relate to the natural world. And I think it's fair to say a lot of people have observed, coming to the hidden gardens can be a transformative experience. It's founded in an ideal, but there's another challenge there then of how do you manifest that ideal in the real world on an ongoing basis? And I think this is the remarkable challenge for the team, Amanda's team, the people who work in the Hidden Gardens, and also the board of the Hidden Gardens Trust. As Amanda said at the beginning, after the design and delivery of the gardens, I kind of stayed involved, was on the board up until last year. And I suppose that's given me an insight into how difficult that process has been, and obviously the challenges that Amanda and co still face day after day and year after year. So the Hidden Gardens, it's a space with an agenda, and the ongoing functioning of it, the things that happen within it, either actively or passively, are at least as important in some ways as the physical space itself. There's an active program of events and things that have happened on an ongoing basis for that whole 10-year period, including a whole range of things that Amanda can describe better than I, but includes the Culture Kitchen, a whole series of artist residencies, all kinds of things, programs and workshops that are happening. And I think that's a real achievement, the fact that that has been happening, and it has been happening for 10 years. Within that, there are lots of challenges of how you manage all the different demands on the space. A lot of people using a small space for a whole number of different reasons. And that has its issues. And it's also around that, the question of how the team keep that core focus on the ideal and don't let that slip. For example, should there be the sale of alcohol on the patio at the back of tramway? It's a question, a thing. Is there a danger there that it starts to slip and become a different kind of space? Does it become the hidden beer gardens, or just a slightly diminished version of itself? So there's a core challenge there of how those aims and the ideal of the garden are taken forward. Another aspect of that is that the aims of the garden are broad. They cut across, if you like, use all the big titles, environmental, health, and cultural and creative issues. And that presents problems in that, if you like, funding, the way funding is organized around a particular topic. It's either a heritage project or a health project or whatever. So in that context, again, I think it's worth noting how remarkable it is that Amanda and the team keep doing what they're doing, and that the gardens sort of grow and develop year on year. In terms of that challenge of how, if you like, that broad range of aims is presented to external audiences and to funders, there are always discussions about how you kind of clarify that, how you simplify it, how you sort of reduce it down. And I suppose that's the question. Maybe it's right that the ambition should be broad and complex, even despite all of those difficulties. And I think if any of you ever have the opportunity, go to the Hidden Gardens Trust AGMs, because for me that was always the point at which it sort of made sense. You saw or you see what the Hidden Gardens is doing, how it functions in lots of different ways. In that, at that point, Amanda invites all of the staff team to come forward, present on what's been happening in terms of the creative and cultural and all the other activities. And sitting and seeing all of that really gives you that sort of overview. And the whole thing, I think, at that point makes sense. So really just to finish on that thought by congratulating Amanda and the team and the board as they go forward. And I think at that point as well, really just sort of like to invite questions. So I don't know, Angus, if you want to come up, and if we do this by microphone or shouting from the floor or whatever format. As Angus says, after 10 years, I mean, the space has been there for 10 years. Many of you are familiar with it and using it, so it's whatever you would like to know or ask, this is a good time to do it, because in this room you have, I think, pretty much all of the key, or many of the key people involved. Stephen Skrinker has just arrived. He's in the building. Chris Rankin's here. Claire Hunter, Angus, and myself. Is there anybody else? Rachel? Hi, Rachel. So you've actually, you know, many of these people probably haven't been in the same room at the Hidden Gardens for the best part of 10 years. So any questions, address them to the floor as well as to the front.
Thanks very much. I think that was wonderful, and thank you very much for sharing the last 10 years of the Hidden Gardens with us. I think there's been a tremendous job done there. What would be really interesting now is to hear from you what you think the next 10 years would be like in the Hidden Gardens. What would happen or what should be happening in that space in terms of your own aspirations. And if you sat here in 10 years' time with a different bunch of people who are involved, what would you like to be saying?
Should we just go to the bar? Yeah. That's really. I found it hard enough to talk about the last 10 years. I think that really it's on the one hand very, very basic, that it just continues to have that same care and it continues to thrive. There was big political ownership of it the day we opened. I always remember this. It was fantastic. It was Frank. Do you remember Frank Pie and Beans Macavity? He was minister. I think he was minister for something at the time. He was Minister for Culture. That's right. And he turned up. It was wonderful. He got whisked in the day before we opened. And Bridget McConnell, who we'd never really seen, whisked in the week before we opened. And they all sat there and said, absolutely wonderful. It's going to be a jewel in Glasgow's crown. And I thought, great, that's what that class of politician and civil servant do. And I'm not really slagging them, because that's inevitably they don't get involved in the grit. They see the final result, and if it's working, they then give ownership. And you know, ultimately the money did come from the council and from some political routes, so fair enough. But that continuing political ownership is really important. So you would want it still to be recognised for what it is, and in a difficult climate, continue to be supported for what it is and what it's doing. Because I think there's not that many places in Scotland or even in the UK that are setting out with this particular way of working and way of bringing people together. And I think Rolf touched on that. I think that over the 10 years, and Linda, the first team who ran this, again did an incredible job to steer away, to keep that money coming in, to have the core staff able to keep it looking and feeling as it is. So really, for me, no difference. I mean, the great thing about a garden is that it evolves slowly. I asked someone this morning, how'd you like it? And they said, I haven't been here for a long time. And I said, do you like the way it's grown? They went, actually, I preferred it when it was a bit more minimal. I said, what do you mean it needs a haircut? They said they wanted the neat lines again. They wanted everything to be much more boxed and geometric. So it was interesting. That was their reaction 9 years on. I think it just evolves naturally, and I like the way it's growing in and the way certain areas have become denser. So no radical difference. I wish that the wider world was a little bit less troubled. I think really that would be my bigger hope is that I don't know, a lot of people came to the millennium and you thought, oh, maybe after the 20th century we're going to be living in a slightly less violent, polarized world. That's a big wish, isn't it?
Well, I suppose the only thing I'd add to that is, well, one of the reasons why I sort of stepped down from the board last year was because I thought the gardens were a really good place, and it was probably at its most effective that it had been in, you know, through that whole period in terms of everything that was going on. I think, and this is a topic that's been discussed many times in that context, was the two things I think maybe Angus as well, and I and others on the board, and I think within the team would like to see perhaps, is that in terms of the creative activity within the gardens, that is upped, and also in terms of, if you like, the wider, if you like, political and cultural issues that within which the Hidden Gardens are sort of founded and are embedded, that it was maybe more actively engaging with those on, if you like, a wider platform. But obviously that's an awful lot to ask, in that there's a small team of people there who are already, you know, delivering way beyond what anybody could reasonably expect. But, you know, I think as an ambition for the future, I think those things would still stand. Is that, do you want the, this is ours.
I just wanted to know, like, what was the relationship between the community consultation that you carried out and the creativity and ideas that you yourselves had? Was it difficult to get a balance between the two at all, or how did you find that process?
Stephen, do you want to? It's quite interesting. Do you want to talk about that a wee bit? Because it was quite. You in a sense made one of the more abstract works, but do you remember? Can you remember back to the consultation and what that meant at the time?
Yeah, it was kind of, it really wasn't anything shopping trolleys and heaps of rubble, and it really was a no man's land. And I think my input was more about surveying what was there before, and then comparing with what it sort of evolved into and what it became. And I think sort of my input came sort of before all the sort of the layout of the community, and sort of leaching into that and bringing it to the space. It really was. I don't know if you've shown any pictures of what it was before, but it really was Desolation Row, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. It's interesting you have to think about the range of work, is that where Stephen's approach was more abstract and he was creating inner worlds within the heels, and you looked in and there were these remarkable interior landscapes. If you take someone like Jerry Luce's work, which is laid onto various stones, and where he created various circular poems and other words that were being drawn from particular religious texts. He, in a sense, his work was much more directly influenced, or was looking at some of the wider issues within the garden. So I think that was the effect there. So, Claire, do you want to come in as well at this point?
Just to say that I suppose I remember at one point Steve had the idea of actually doing a knitted underground of flowers. Do you remember that? And so there was talk then of obviously community involvement. Should that kind of crazy idea have come to fruition, which it might have done, and then there could have been communities involved in actually making parts of that artwork. So nothing was ruled out in terms of what any artist was approaching, and then looking to see how the community might be involved in whatever process of development of an artwork. and for some artists that was more, and for some what they required was basically all the notes that were taken of the conversations with both organisations and individuals went to every artist, so they could be witnesses to the conversations, and then they could use those conversations to inform the kind of artwork they then created. That's really the process.
Julius was a very direct result of that. It's the will and the form of having moving watershed. There must be moving water in the garden. Absolutely, you're going to deal with these things, and that again was a clear reflection of the way, in particular, garden design, the use of water and moving water.
And I think through those questionnaires, as Rob said, moving water was one of the key things that everybody was agreed on that they really wanted.
I think, I mean, if I understand your question correctly, it was sort of about the relationship between, if you like, the consultation and the creative and design work. And I suppose my feeling and my recollection of it is, and hopefully I think Chris would echo this as well, was that it was a very seamless process in that because it happened over the period of time that it did, a year or whatever, was that we were able to ask some questions, think about it, you know, there's some creative response to that, and then being able to sort of go back and, if you like, have further discussion about aspects or things that might relate to that, albeit that, if you like, the design itself was quite late in evolving. It was just really, I think, a pretty seamless dialogue backwards and forwards in a way that often it isn't, because often it's, you know, it's happening in that amount of time. There isn't the sort of the structure or the broader creative team around the whole thing, so that it's really, something's developed, it's shown to people, and it's like, do you like it or not? Or, you know, and it very much wasn't like that. The whole, you know, from that very first point of what should the space be like, what should the gardens be, all the way through, it was an evolving dialogue. And I just, you know, I suppose I was trying to express that earlier, is that, you know, unfortunately, that's I think relatively rare. You know, the process with the Hidden Gardens was written up in various contexts, internationally and nationally, as best practice, and yet, to my knowledge, nothing like that has been done again in terms of a delivered built project in Scotland since then, which is, you know, kind of disappointing.
Chris, is there anything you'd like to say 10 years on?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. He was always a man of few words and a good pen. Very good. Anyone else?
I really enjoyed the talk. Please don't take this the wrong way either. It might sound a bit negative, but I don't intend it to be like that. I have a sort of little background in landscape gardening as well, like more construction side of it. And it's to me, it's a very deliberate geometrical shape. And I just wondered, I was hoping maybe when you were speaking, the designer guy, I was hoping you'd maybe explain why you insisted upon that real straight line thing. When I worked in gardening, we focused on not having straight lines. So for me, that's a real kind of contrast to what I think a natural garden would look like. So I just wondered now why, you've obviously insisted on the, you know, it's a deliberate thing. I'm just wondering why.
Chris is pleased he's sitting in the back now. But it's... you forced me to sort of do what I wasn't going to do, which is to sort of describe the design a little bit. But basically, if you strip it back and what had happened on this site historically, apart from going way back before there was any human stuff happening on it, it was a plant, tree and seed nursery, and it was all organised in these strong north-south lines. It was then developed for an industrial purpose as tramcar works, and again, all of that in terms of the buildings, the concrete floors, all of the supporting structures are on that axial thing. So really, in terms of the design, a big part of it was responding to that. I mean, if you go out, you see, obviously there are elements there that are retained, walls and so on, that are from those earlier structures which have that strong line and geometry. And then also, for instance, the blocks of planting, as you're looking at from the back, those ones over there, are all actually set into the underfloor structure. That concrete surface is the factory floor, and the plantings planted into the voids. So really, if you like, all of those lines and shapes were pretty much already there, and we were just basically responding to that, and then we overlaid onto that, if you like, other things which were arising through this dialogue in terms of, if you like, cultural and horticultural traditions, the introduction of what became, I suppose, shorthand name for it, of the square route, the loop walk, and the axial path through, and all the rest of it were really sort of overlaid on what was already there. So it was in part responding to the site and its history for the most part, and then within that introducing other things. So I think in that context, introducing a kind of sinuous lines and so on, or fairy mounds or whatever, probably would have been less successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that everyone responds to is the contrast between the very organized geometric front area and then the mound at the back. And the mound was actually a rubble mound. I mean, it really was absolute, and there's still a lot of rubble underneath it. So we mounded soil over the rubble mound because of the colonized and self-seeded birches. So there was that was the great thing, was that the site had some quite mature trees ringing the edges of it because of the corridor of the train line behind. You had a good framing of tall trees, which was one of the reasons why the site's been so successful, was that you didn't just look through to the buildings behind. The new addition, obviously, on the right, it's pretty intense in winter, I have to say. The first time I saw it, I thought the building was quite overpowering of the site. But actually now, again, that you've got 6 or 7 months of the year with tree growth, it's a fascinating relationship between the Gurdwara and the site, so it actually works. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Hi, I'd just like to ask both Angus and Rolf how working on the Hidden Gardens has informed all of your subsequent work.
Yeah, that's another good one. This was, NVA's been going quite a while. We're probably into our 20-something year now, so it's been a long, I can look back on quite a long passage of work. And the Hidden Gardens was a first step to doing something permanent. I think probably at the time I would have been slightly more arrogant about the idea that it was really, if you've made only temporary work and you've made stuff that lasts a few weeks or a few months or a show or an event or an installation, and then you think, well, wouldn't it be great to do something that's there permanently and that people can come back to year after year and will grow in a different way? And then you get that kind of, it'll be there after I've died, and you get into this whole sort of, it's much more important. And then you realize, well, you're even less important. So you go through a kind of double take. So rather than that being arrogant, it actually makes you feel more humble because you realize it's all kind of not worthless, but, you've got a few years left, and then you're going to be, I'll probably be under one of the round trees in about 25 years' time. Hopefully doing more good than I am now. But the serious point from that was I did a show a few years ago up in Argyll and with the National Theatre, and it was a piece of work that nearly broke me. I really had a bad time making that piece of work. You do good things, and every now and again you sort of hit brick walls, and creatively it was a very low time for me. I'm not going to bore you, don't worry, with the reasons why. But 6 months after that, I was sat with Ellen, who co-directs NVA with me, and we thought, what we're going to do. It's always that, there's a certain moment where you describe, let's say you have a field, and every now and again it grows something really good, but then there's the fallow bit in between before you can grow something again. We were definitely in the fallow bit, and we were sat in that fallow field going, what are we going to do next? Because we can't do this again. This isn't what it's about. And we both looked back and we thought, it's the Hidden Gardens was the thing that we were actually most proud of. That we'd spent that 2 years, worked with an amazing group of people and made something good happen in the city. So we then, out of that, said, we're going to dedicate ourselves to St. Peter's, Kilmahue, and trying to rescue this insanely difficult modernist ruin out in Cardross. And so that was, for me, the legacy was that we would use probably our last 20 years of before we start dribbling. Might be 10 years down the line, but just to use your creative life to again try and do something that can really just be more meaningful than just doing temporary work that just appears and disappears, appears, disappears. So that's what it's done for me, is basically to teach us that it's worth doing things that last for longer, even if we don't.
I suppose, yes, it was learning, and I think going through that process, and I mean at that point I suppose I was about 30, and so was Chris. You're not 30 anymore, are you? It's but yeah, no, I think it's because it was such a good, I'm not just saying it was a really good process in that, for all the reasons that we've been talking about in terms of the timescale, in terms of the group of people creatively and how everyone worked together, it almost, I think, since then, it acts almost as a benchmark of, or a demonstration of, how it can happen and how it should happen. And it's a really good, touchstone or point of reference in going forward when you're presented often with challenging situations on projects which are almost the antithesis of that, where it's, it's got to be done in 5 minutes and we don't care what the outcome is or whatever. It's just trying to sort of, well, A, not get into those situations, B, to try and create more situations like that, and also to take all of the things that demonstrates forward in other work.
Take a last question or two and then let you go, and then we can if anyone wants to, we'll go and have some nice soup and chat.
Angus, as you know, managing gardens is about managing change. And gardens, like our own lives, have different stages. They talk about 7 ages of man. You could talk about 7 ages of a garden. We now have a teenager. It's getting a bit woolly and hairy in places. You mentioned that someone liked the idea of the structured lines coming back in, and I think these grids and lines and the contrast between them and the woodland actually are a strong part of its sense of place and its calming effect. But what advice would you and Rolf give to managing change as the garden goes through its teenage years and into its early life? Because it will change, it won't stay the same. And how do you feel it would be best to continue to ensure, as happened at the beginning, it's the community that manage and drive that change?
Okay, I'll pick up on something that we discussed as part of the board process, certainly up until end of last year, which I sort of think might be a good way of taking forward. Because referencing back to the front end of the project, there was I'm trying to remember how it's framed. It was there was board representation from the community. A sort of an advisory board made up of local people, and I think that was, I think, very successful early on, but it's, I think, almost when the project's happened and it's there and it's sort of ticking along, obviously that, the sense of purpose to that to some extent falls away. So I think there have been periods where, if you like, the refreshing or the renewal of the community involvement in the decision making, the development of the gardens has sort of dipped. And one of the things that was being discussed, you guys are probably still talking about it, I don't know, or maybe you're implementing it. It was this thing of almost, whether it's 2 or 4 times a year, almost like if you like, an open, what was the term that was, it was like a town hall event thing, where the Hidden Gardens kind of tries to draw in the wider community, and there's a sort of a really focused exercise, just a new process that... A new dialogue, and trying to actively draw people in. Some of those people might want to keep an ongoing, relationship with it. Others might just want to dip into these one-off events that are happening. But basically to kind of refresh that and to create a structure for that to happen on an ongoing basis, because it's difficult, I think, to realise that this thing about the ideal, the starting point of the project was an ideal, and that's realised, or the attempt to realise that in the physical space at the front end, but then year after year, 10 years down the line, and facing all of those practical challenges of keeping that interest, keeping the funding coming in, all of those other very basic background things, is just how you keep that alive and keep it fresh. And I think there were some good ideas discussed within the board and elsewhere around that, and I kind of think that's probably pretty crucial to move forward now.
I think it's absolutely vital to keep that momentum going. I mean, Angus, you spoke about the energy that was there at the beginning, and I think there's always a great energy when you create something, but once it's built and it's there, and the world has changed, and you have changed, and the community has changed, and the garden changes, sometimes that energy can become faded. I mean, I remember the Light Festival, and it's relighting that energy. It's bringing it back to life again in difficult times, globally, politically, socially, economically. But it still has that voice, and it's putting that voice on a box and giving it a chance to grow. Do you think one of the answers to that might be to return to our artistic roots?
Yeah, I mean, I think that art is always the great way to communicate in a way that Rolf talked a little bit. One of the garden's strengths is that it isn't a one agenda thing. It can be, at times, it could be health, could be environmental, could be different community representations working together. So there's lots of different starting points for the way something happens. But the great thing is that you've got this incredible starting point. You've got this fantastic place where people feel very comfortable. There's something very rich as a building block. And actually, I'm going to, maybe to finish, I'm going to ask Amanda to come in and see what she thinks. But the brilliant thing about art is its ability to communicate, sometimes in very complex ways, but also sometimes in very direct, simple ways. And that's it's a very good way to re-energize, because it always brings. I mean, the most obvious thing now is that there's the Gurdwara next door.
Exactly.
And everyone coming out of the open day there today says it's incredible, brilliant atmosphere, good energy. So that's the first link, is to get that gate open and get everyone coming out of the Gurdwara after they've been there for worship and coming into the garden. It's the most simple thing. It used to happen with the central mosque. A lot of people coming, a lot of people coming in from central mosque and spending time in the garden. And that still happens in lots of ways, but just again, continuing that flow of people, so you get good, interesting mixes of people, and then build on that with working with particular artists who have the sensitivity and capability to take that to interesting places.
So that sort of 10 years, the 10th birthday, as it were, it's not the end of the journey, it's the beginning of a new one.
No, absolutely. I think that's very well put. Amanda, do you want to?
Thanks, Angus. I think it's what you were talking about is a combination of partnership working and engaging with the local community and placing value on those who are currently engaged with the gardens, the volunteers, those who are actively engaged in our programmes, and the team of staff who are actively engaged in networking within the communities around about us. So I think it's all of those things feeding in to inform the direction that the gardens takes in the next decade. Yeah, I would agree. And I think what's wonderful about the legacy, something we would want to keep alive, is that it's about the process is through horticulture and through art, and that can take many different forms. Keeps it fresh and alive. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think it's. I'm very aware that my my input was early on, and maybe up to the 4th, 5th year of its life, and since then it's very much, the mantle has been taken on with its own board, and it carries on beyond my starting point. So I haven't, it'd be totally wrong to come in here and sort of dictate. It's not meaningful to do that. It has to be passed on, and people take it forward with their values. If there's one thing the only thing I would pass on is just that notion that when we talk about it as a place of peace, that's not a passive position. Peace by its very nature is something that often has to be fought for. And that's what I'll leave as perhaps my final statement. But thanks very, very much to everyone for coming, for staying with it so well. And I think, as always, hopefully good conversation should be followed by good soup.